This video is sponsored by Innsmouth Soap. Scale your hygiene routine up and unleash your inner deep one. Peeling skin? That's only the path to a new you. Brought to you by the Esoteric Order of Dagon. Go to www.dagonsoap.com and type in the code esoteric1890 to get 46% off. Because nothing says summer like eldritch abominations with squamous tendrils writhing under a horned gibbous moon. I'll try to keep this brief, since my brother is recording a Let's Play of Doki Doki Literature Club in the other room. My first encounter with H.P. Lovecraft was when I skimmed my uncle's vintage copy of The Doom That Came to Sarnath and Other Stories, but I was only 8 or 9 at the time, and didn't remember who wrote them. Then, in high school, I watched Pan's Labyrinth, my favorite movie of all time, so I did research on Guillermo del Toro. One of his greatest influences is H.P. Lovecraft, so I discovered Lovecraft's fiction. Of course, I'd seen so many of the references, but this was when I really became interested in his work. It wasn't until last summer, though, when I was recovering from an illness, that I made an effort to read all of Lovecraft's work. It took me until November, but I did, and here I'm going to recommend some of my favorites. I know, talking about something I enjoy on YouTube.com. I'm using the platform wrong, and by talking, I mean reading off this somewhat comprehensible salad dressing I splattered all over Microsoft Word. Oh well. I should note, however, that it's been a while since I did the reading, and I sometimes took long breaks from the reading, so my memory is a little iffy. The Lovecraft subreddit is actually doing a reading club soon, so I'll have the opportunity to read these stories again and offer more discussion on them. Let me know if there's a story in particular you want me to look at in greater detail. Also, this is going to be a two-parter, so if you're wondering why is there no The Color Out of Space or The Shadow over Innsmouth, they're coming, don't worry. This list is mostly for people new to Lovecraft. I won't get as analytical as I like because I want you to be able to experience these stories without everything being given away by me. Well, until I can't help myself and ramble at length like the true person with an English degree. Also, because either there were long stretches between reading, or because I read many stories in quick succession, there are stories I want to recommend but can't remember much about, so I'm going to add them in a list after I discuss some of these stories. Okay, let's dive in. This story, though not Lovecraft's first he'd ever written, marks a very strong Poe influence, but it also has some very autobiographical elements from Lovecraft's childhood, such as a young boy who loses himself in stories and sees nymphs and creatures in the forest. In the tomb, a young man who finds his family tomb believes he transports back to his ancestors' time, which also feels very connected to how Lovecraft essentially saw himself as born in the wrong century. He was obsessed with the 1700s, including certain spellings and phrases he used in his letters and his writing. Overall, very creepy and atmospheric, with an engaging concept, and not a bad start for published work. Dagon is the first story that feels like a mythos story, if for the only reason that there's a grand entity that is of the aquatic nature. But there's also the hint of the older civilization of creatures that worship Dagon. In The Shadow over Innsmouth, there is the Esoteric Order of Dagon, which makes sense. A group of people who married the Deep One, so their generations become fish people, all worship a big fish dude. So people who like Big Fish Boy really like regular-sized fish boys. Or is it the other way around? The passage of time and the build of tension are solid here, when there's a lead-up to the narrator seeing what we assume is Dagon, and he observes the rest of the island. There's a lingering eeriness with that whole nothing is scarier sort of thing, where you don't see the monster yet, but you're waiting, and you're lost with the main character. The transition of Juan Romero is about a man who works in a mine and befriends a man named Juan Romero. To be honest, the first thing that compelled me to read this story, I read it years before I got my collection, was my surprise that there's a Lovecraft story with a character named Juan Romero. And yes, I can confirm, I'm not going to repeat what is said about Mexican people in this story. What the fuck, Dad?
No, I don't know what I expected.
Nevertheless, the narrative is rather brief, but I like how ambiguous it is, and what happens to Juan Romero, well, I've heard different interpretations. What happens to Romero at the end is described in the story as terrible, which people read as him having a bad fate, but I thought of it in sort of a gothic, sublime terror kind of way, where terrible sort of describes this ascension, this sort of fear that also has awe in it, which is different than just horror. Anne Radcliffe, a 19th century gothic horror writer, differentiated between horror and terror. Horror is more superficial, like seeing a scary monster and feeling scared. But terror, or the sublime, has a strange wonder that comes with being horrified or disgusted. It's like how awesome and awful both kind of mean having awe. You can be scared but thrilled or even elevated by the same sight. So, to the narrator, what happens to one looks frightening, but it could also be this transformation that goes beyond human understanding. So to a human, it's horrible, but only because we can't fully comprehend it. I think this sort of reaction to witnessing something beyond our kin is something that comes back in a lot of Lovecraft's works, where the entities and sights we read about are scary and messed up, but at least I am always astounded by how paradoxically imaginative and yet ambiguous these horrors tend to be. Speaking of nothing is scarier, in the statement of Randolph Carter, we experience untold horrors not from watching The Witness, but by hearing the sight being relayed by his friend. Pretty effective overall. Randolph Carter, our introspective hero who shows up, sometimes unexpectedly, in many Lovecraft stories. And did anyone else feel like there was homoerotic subtext between Carter and Hurley Warren, the man he lived with for 7 years? No, just me. I mean, Warren was based off Samuel Loveman, since this was loosely based off a dream Lovecraft had, so... Okay, so I'm like dying now, so if you hear my fan, I'm so sorry. I live in Georgia and it's summer, so yeah. The Cats of Ulthar. Anyway, in The Cats of Ulthar, a young boy in the Dreamlands who comes to Ulthar, a little town full of cats and cobblestones and gambrel roosts, befriends a small black kitten, but the kitten goes missing. It's implied that there's a couple in the town who hates cats so much, despite living in a town known for being full of cats, that they kill them. So, the boy, angered, puts a curse on them, and what happens next will warm your heart. The first glimpse into the Dreamlands, and besides the gothic and weird horror, the dark fantasy vibes of the Dreamlands are really appealing to me. The inspiration is Lord Dunsany, but the surreal and at times random nature of it all feels reminiscent of a darker wonderland, and this is just such a delightfully gruesome revenge story. Also, if you watch the anime The Ancient Magus' Bride, this story is heavily prevalent in an earlier episode. Facts concerning the late Arthur German and his family. Woo boy! The first of quite a few stories about men who find out that their family either had odd relationships that led to intermixing depicted as monstrous, or their families committed horrible deeds, which lead the protagonist to go mad. Stories in this group include this one, The Lurking Fear, The Rats in the Walls, and The Shadow over Innsmouth. So, dark hereditary is a common theme, which shows a fear of degeneration or the corruption of, quote, a good bloodline. I think what I enjoyed about this one was how it went through a long line of the German family. I know Lovecraft was obsessed with genealogy, and I enjoyed the aspect of going through this bloodline and seeing what happened to each family member. The Duke getting killed for trying to fuck a white ape was interesting too. Also, this story isn't the first I expect to be alluded to in a recent video game, but here we are.
I don't care about your petty excuses.
What?
No one leaves the port until my son is found, and that is final.
I guess this is Throgmorton.
Excuse me. Are you Robert Throgmorton?
I am, but not interested. Go away.
No, we're not gonna say your features are unusual. Rude.
Nyarlathotep is probably my favorite Lovecraftian entity. Something I appreciate about Nyarlathotep is his fluid nature. He's a shapeshifter, but his nature itself also changes. In one story, he's like Tesla. In another, he wears someone's face and hands. In another, he's like a pharaoh, or he's the devil, and in another, he possesses a human body. I like that sort of chaos, which fits into someone who's a crawling chaos, though I know that in the end it isn't really intentional, because Lovecraft didn't have a concrete backstory and intention for every entity. He would just use their names and make things up and then stick these previously used names on them. He didn't go in initially with elaborately planned mythos. In this story, Nyarlathotep is a Tesla-like figure who travels around and hypnotizes others with his vision, eventually transporting and trapping them in another realm. The final, intentionally nonsensical image of this other realm, this dreamlike purgatory, is incredibly haunting. Woo, oh boy. I said I wouldn't get too deep in this stuff. I said I'd keep it brief.
Dumb bitch.
This story is best described as Mary Shelley's Frankenstein crossed with Edgar Allan Poe, where the narrator goes to what seems like a party only to scare off the attendees and realizing they are some sort of monster. The Outsider opens with a John Keats poem from the Eve of St. Agnes that gives off this mystical and forlorn sense of isolation and longing. That night, the Baron dreamt of many a woe, and all of his warrior guests, with shade and form of witch and demon and large coffin worm, were long be-nightmared. This sets the tone well, and it doesn't hurt that I love John Keats. Gone too soon, sweet prince. Here's some more. The opening line for The Outsider. Unhappy is he to whom the memories of childhood bring only fear and sadness. And the closing line. I know always that I am an outsider, a stranger in this century and among those who are still men. Where do I even start? The Lovecraft scholar and author S.T. Joshi says in A Dreamer and a Visionary, H.P. Lovecraft in his time, that he doesn't necessarily see this melancholy older childhood from the opening line as autobiographical. Since Lovecraft had a nice childhood he looks fondly on. While I generally agree we shouldn't overthink autobiographical context in a story, since there comes the danger of assuming every thought or characteristic presented in the story belongs to the author, I would argue Lovecraft's childhood being happy is more of a tragedy than if he'd always been unhappy. As a child, the adults around him would indulge him and give him everything. He had his grandfather who helped his love of stories flourish. He had a childhood home he loved and a childhood pet cat he adored. After his grandfather died, when Lovecraft was 14, all that was lost. And afterward, especially in his early adulthood, he suffered from mental breakdowns and suicidal thoughts. While he lived with his mother, there were moments of tense silence as his mother's mental health deteriorated. And eventually she was locked up in a psychiatric hospital. He lost his whimsical childhood, and it was replaced with grief and longing. Sure, it's good he had a happy childhood, but when you look back on what once was and was taken from you, it can lead to bitterness or sadness. Let's look at the entire context of the first paragraph. Unhappy is he to whom the memories of childhood bring only fear and sadness. Wretched is he who looks back upon the lone hours in vast and dismal chambers with brown hangings and maddening rows of antique books, or upon awed watches and twilight groves of grotesque, gigantic, and vine-encumbered trees that silently wave twisted branches far aloft. Such a lot the gods gave to me, the dazed, the disappointed, the barren, the broken. And yet I am strangely content, and cling desperately to those sere memories when my mind momentarily threatens to reach beyond to the other. It's 2 a.m. What am I doing with my life? Oh, wait. The emphasis on disappointment and brokenness, as well as withering, to me signals the narrator experiencing disillusionment, sadness, and fear because of change, as well as an emptiness in their surroundings. Specifically, their mental state is impacted upon thinking of how things have gone from blossoming to withering. Not to say this is an autobiographical slant, but I think that reading has some evidence behind it. There are interpretations of this text, much like with Frankenstein, that look at it through a queer or feminist lens. As with Frankenstein, who is ostracized by society, Frankenstein's monster rather, the narrator has been interpreted as in their social isolation, possibly representing the plight of women or a queer person. Granted, it's doubtful Lovecraft intended this lens, but readers can analyze and even empathize in many different ways. Unfortunately, I haven't read these analyses, such as the one by Robert Price, and haven't read the story in full in a while, but this is definitely one I want to look at again. I also want to point out these words by Caitlin Kiernan in the documentary Fear of the Unknown when discussing Lovecraft's deeply prejudiced reactions to living in New York after marrying Sonia Green.
And I think when he referred to himself as an unassimilated alien, I think he understood that when he was in New York, on some level he understood, despite all of his protestations, that New York worked. You know, despite his perception of it as this horrid, chaotic cesspool, it was something that worked. He didn't work.
H.P. Lovecraft, who felt out of place as a, quote, gentleman, who wanted to live in the 17th century, in many ways didn't have or acknowledge certain social limitations, except for his poor health as a child, which may or may not have been psychosomatic and the result of his mother coddling him, and a poor financial situation after his grandfather's death. However, I think this idea of anxiety of being an outsider because something is missing from you is really poignant. Lovecraft struggled to find a job, and despite the help and recommendations of his friends, almost seemed to self-sabotage by not pursuing opportunities or writing extremely self-effacing cover letters. He thinks he's superior to everyone because of what he perceives as a pure English bloodline, but everyone around him seems to be functioning while he floundered, and no doubt found himself humiliated and emasculated as he had to rely on his wife for financial support. Why is it everyone else can function, but he can't? There's a frustration, but also an acceptance where to go beyond who he is now is terrifying. To keep trying and failing is worse than conceding and stagnating. Now, Lovecraft didn't just stop changing. He did change throughout his life, but he also had a strong aversion to change, which is unsurprising, since most of the changes in his early life were negative and full of loss and regret. The lurking fear. Okay, all I really remember from this one, besides feeling like it's the fall of the House of Usher, kind of, which is my favorite Edgar Allan Poe story, is that it has lightning monsters, which I thought, yeah, it was pretty cool and different. Next, the rats in the walls. This is one that really messes with me, and though I get why some of the other stories might freak you out more, at first I liked this story, but I didn't think about its implications as much. Then I read Sex and the Cthulhu Mythos by Bobby Derry, and he talked about some of the narrative backdrop, and basically the story centers around a man who lives in Exon Priory, an abandoned ancestral home, after his son dies in World War I. The main character, Delapore, is part of an esteemed bloodline with the least subtle allusion to Edgar Allan Poe, De La Poere, and a dark history. He has these weird dreams and learns more about his family, and he even says that his family was so vile and deviant they'd make the Marquis de Sade and Gilles de Rais look like novices, which really caught me off guard. And there's this idea planted that his ancestors were far worse than the horror erotica of Sade, or a serial killer who sexually abused and tortured children to sacrifice them to the devil for money. And you just go, oh, those guys were nothing compared to my family. Thanksgiving must have been real interesting. Also, both the examples of terrible people are French, by the way. And the reveal of what his ancestors were actually doing actually gives me chills thinking about it. After reading and remembering about it, after reading part of Sex and the Cthulhu Mythos, I rested in bed and just kept thinking about it. Just one word. Swineherd. Also, I don't like rats. Although at least these ones don't have human faces like some. I want to talk about this one more in depth one day. Anyway, that's part of my recommended Lovecraft stories. See ya, bye. And if someone offers to set you up with a date with a person who wears a veil and makes strange croaking noises and has an odd fishy odor, reconsider, unless you're into that. And if you meet an ape princess named Rosie,
Yeah.
1891 must have been a busy year for Francis.
What?
Give me just half a second. What the fuck?